Hello there and welcome to this SQLBit session. It's my pleasure to be here today and thank you for joining me. My name is Stirrup and we're going to have a business intelligence session about the data lifecycle. So who am I? Well, that's a picture of me there. I call myself the data whisperer because I have a quiet voice and I love getting gems and data. So I have 23 years of industry experience in IT. My background originally was artificial intelligence and then I moved into business intelligence. I learned to program when I was 8 years old on a Sinclair ZX81 and I learned in BASIC and I've been obsessed with computers and data ever since. So I've won a few awards, one of the top 20 global women in technology, and one of the top 100 global data visionaries. I'm also an international keynote speaker, industry analyst, and I'm very, very fortunate to do things with data that I love and making an impact. So if you've got any questions, please reach out to my website. I'm also on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and I'm happy to take questions. So in this topic, we're going to take more of a strategic look at data. There are plenty of sessions that tell you how you can do great things with Power BI. I'm here to talk about the why. Why is that important? How should we move forward and why is that important? Because data itself can be viewed as having a product life cycle. So data can be collected, analysed, visualised, utilised and then monetized. So if you're a decision maker, you're wondering how we can generate ideas and formulate a strategy. So what happens after we become data-driven? What's next? So the triangle of people, processes and technology is tired. We need to think about information. I'd also argue that the term data-driven is pretty tired as well. I think we need to be understanding-driven, where we seek to understand. Rather than being driven by data, we are driven by a need to understand and to make sense of the culture that exists around our data. So in this session, we're going to look more about how we can understand our data. We will look at some details of how to do this in Power BI, but it's not an overly technical session. I'm more interested in grappling with the more complex, data-oriented questions that businesses have to look at. So we will be looking more about the destination of the data rather than the journey. So we can call data an asset. In this time of the pandemic, what I am seeing is more small to medium businesses not doing so well. And that's borne out by some of the press releases we see from Microsoft, for example. They're talking about how they're focusing more on the enterprise. And the reason for that is quite simple. Unfortunately, it looks like a lot of small to medium businesses may not survive or may not do very well due to the economic uncertainty. It may turn out that they are bought, over, merged or acquired, and data will be one of their most valuable assets. Since we are not working in offices quite as much, I can see organisations having a fire sale, actually. But the data will remain one of the most important things that a company has. Data can help an organisation generate its insights, and we should be inspired by analytics to make informed and understanding-driven decisions in order to achieve and further business goals. Organisations need to consider their investment in their portfolio and how they manage their data, and how they can maximise the use of the data to drive the business forward in line with the business mission. Organisations are dealing with very difficult, dynamic and complex environments. We see that data creation, integration, consumption and delivery are incredibly rapid and fluid. So together, all of these choices and complexities give businesses a very baffling set of continually changing options of things that they can do with their data. But they need to be included right from the start in the decision making. It's not only an IT issue. Data belongs to everyone. We're all part of the creative class. So how can we move forward? We need to consider a data strategy. Now, a data strategy is the purpose of maximising the value that data delivers to an organisation. You have to start with the end in mind. It used to be the case that data was a byproduct of a business or some business activity. You bought something and that generated some data. However, now we live in a world of continuous transformation. We sometimes call this digital transformation, but it's maybe more a concept of continually transforming the business, and data is very much part of that. When we build projects, we necessarily create technical debt. If you don't believe you've got any technical debt, I recommend you go away and think a little bit hard about it. You will probably also have data debt in there as well. I've blogged about this before, and when I talk about data debt, what I mean is the mistakes and the shortcuts that people make when they start to build data-based systems. That could be not dealing with missing data, something as simple as that, or it could be not taking a proper canvas of the data estate before you start. Very few organisations I speak to bother to do a data dictionary, and then they don't really know their data. We used to talk about garbage in and garbage out as a data warehousing methodology, but it also applies to artificial intelligence and machine learning, data science as well. You won't have any of those things unless you're able to think clearly about your own data. We're also going to consider what value actually means to an organisation. We often think or hear the questions, what does value look like? But it's hard to measure, and that's something I'd like to discuss in a little bit more detail. So since data is more than a byproduct of a business activity or a process, what does this mean? Well, that can really mean that there's a process of continuous transformation to improve, inspire, and implement positive, understanding-driven advancement. When I think about a data strategy, one thing I do try to set up is a cloud centre of excellence. And that's a centralised expertise, which is a team, and they become the trailblazers in the organisation. Many organisations are still not using the cloud as much as they could. And I'm trying to set up a team that is going to be successful, and that success will be something that will act as a beacon for other teams to move forward. So having that cloud centre of excellence can really help. Excuse me. We can also think about how we curate our data source, how we can have the proper policies and guardrails in place to serve up data to the right people at the right time. Very often that can look like a business problem that has been solved by IT. But businesses tend to get ignored in the process, and they need to be included right from the start. We need to put the business back into business intelligence, and it's not something that I see very often. But that does mean we have to manage expectations really carefully. I see organisations that think their data warehouse should be like Google. They should just type something in and get an answer right back. Unfortunately, we're not there yet. Systems and data are still hard, and we have to think about how we can manage that. Another thing I'd say is that design documents, when we build these systems, they can often be quite living documents. But that can mean we can get scope creep and misunderstandings, and the business don't understand what's being delivered. The business teams don't always get good quality answers to explain why they are getting one thing when they actually expected something else. Or they're not always explained properly why they are getting delays in the process as well. So IT and the business have to talk to one another a bit better. And part of a data strategy can be to implement the Gartner Business Intelligence Competency Centre. I think they're calling it the analytics team now. They keep changing the name. But that really means taking people from each department, putting them round a table and trying to get them to record and then move forward from what's wrong with the data to making some small successes which are iterative. In that way, innovation becomes iterative in the organisation. Because when we look at iteration, it can often look like iterating that's failing, but actually you're learning things as you go away and do things with results in mind. And the way that to stay very focused in that is to think about the mission of the organisation itself and not stepping too far away from that. Is it helping to lift your bottom line? If not, it should be. And maybe we're all looking at the wrong things. So another thing that I think about with the data strategy is the budgets. So continuous transformation is the new normal, whether we like it or not, or the next normal, we should be calling it maybe. And organisations need to understand it's never really finished. It's something that keeps happening. We keep improving and optimising. So moving data to the cloud or making more use of your data that's in the cloud already is part of a continuous transformation. And it's not really an end in itself. So to do that, we need to think about the budget for technical debt, and that should be split away from the cloud migration budget. It's very easy to tuck technical debt in a project which is all about cloud migration. And when we talk about technical debt there, I also mean data debt as well. Data debt is the sum of every suboptimal decision that you've made over the life cycle of a data-oriented project. That debt accumulates, and eventually the bill comes in, and it's got to be paid, but not necessarily out of the cloud migration budget. So having those two split out can help the business teams to understand what they need to do in order to be successful, because sometimes those technical debt or data debt issues can appear as if they are cloud migration issues, and it can look like the whole thing is not going very well, but actually that's not true. So a cloud migration budget sometimes is forced to try and repay the technical debt, but they should be separate, otherwise the organisation is repaying a decade of technical debt inside the context of a cloud migration. That's not always the right way forward. It's good to split them out. The data debt can be split off and trying to be focused on properly so that people can start to see success, because it will come if people start to tackle it properly. So we also have to think about what does sign-off look like, and that really means what does success look like when we do a data strategy. What is the end in mind? So the business sometimes can agree a tolerance of error for data migration, and that could be that 95% of records will be successfully migrated, and there's a margin of error there of about 5%. So sometimes that can happen because we have to accept at some point things are moving so fast that we can't imagine every single scenario that might happen. But it's all about testing and catching those errors as well. And the business should really be involved in reconciliation testing and sampling. And that's something that should be considered as well when we look at a data strategy. We also need to think about what business value means. And that can be something that means something different for every organisation. So for some organisations, value or success could mean getting actionable insights that drive decisions that directly impact and raise the bottom line. But for other organisations, this value could mean the monetisation of data as an asset that is actually for sale. So it's important to understand what value looks like and what does success look like for that organisation and work towards that. So now we're going to think a bit about data specifically and data for decisions. Now there's a whole range of pieces of data in an organisation that decision makers will look at in order to identify success. Again, it comes back to understanding what value means for that organisation. Is it monetisation of data? Are you trying to sell it? Or is it perhaps increasing the bottom line? Well, that's more about improving the financial performance of the organisation. You could look at measuring customer satisfaction. So we could look at the Net Promoter Score, NPS, something that marketers look at. And you could also identify project success as well. So how do you know if a project is successful? Is it because it was delivered on time? within budget? How does that look like to you? Okay, so let's take a look at how we can visualize some of this in Power BI. So you see on the screen, I've just put up some sample data, and this is a net debt analysis. Now, normally when we consider visualization of profit and loss, people start to put in green and red, but we know that's not good for colourblind people. So I've kept the crimson red colour because that normally conveys a debt, and I have changed the green to a more indigo blue. In order to do that, what I have done is I've used an HTML colour wheel. I've typed in the colour codes and I've got a range of colours back. So we don't have time to cover colour theory here. It is a really interesting topic, but that's why I've gone for this colour palette. Now, what else I've done is I've called out a few items. We've got net debt breakdown. You can see that at the top left-hand side. Alright, I'm sorry about that. My dog, this is Archie, keeps making noises, so I decided he should just come in the video while I talk about this. So what we're doing is looking at the debt net analysis, and I've got two colours identifying the net debt breakdown on the top left hand side. I've made those lighter colours of the crimson. The reason for that is we tend to categorise by colour very quickly when we look at visualisation. So if you look at something like a Rubik's Cube, for example, you see straight away that you don't need to tell people what to do with a Rubik's Cube. They do tend to know what to do with it as soon as they see it. So we tend to categorise information by colour really well. So what we need to do here is find ways of conveying differences in that information. So we tend to assume that brighter, darker and more intense colours are higher and greater in value than more insipid colours. So the reason I've called out net debt breakdown in particular is that it's for transparency according to this data. We've got the net debt for IFRS and we've got perpetual hybrid bonds. Those are called out specifically in this particular chart. And the reason for that is just transparency instead of lumping them together. So we've also got underlying net debt here, and you can see that at the bottom of the left hand side. You can see for 2018 the value is higher than 2019. So we can see that things are heading in the right direction, and I've made that colour a bit darker so that we can call out the underlying net debt more clearly over what it was last year as opposed to what it was the year before. So I've called that out, and the reason being that our eyes match up these colours really quickly. So I've identified the profit as being a more indigo colour. Now, I'm not a huge fan of pie charts, and I'm not a huge fan of donut charts that you see here. But this was the easiest way to visualise the data in Power BI. And it's quite simple. I don't mind using them as much if they are just showing 2 or 3 segments, which is what this is doing. But generally speaking, they take up a lot of space for not very much bang for your buck, really, the real estate in the page. So I tend to prefer lines because from the visualization perspective, we tend to categorise lines in length of line much more quickly than we do area and angles, so it becomes much easier to read. So I hope that explains a little bit why I've gone for that specific colour choice and why I've gone for those visuals. Now, when we try and do anything with a balance sheet or a profit and loss, there are very specific rules on how these are displayed. So what you can see here is I've put in an order column for each of those. So that's the net debt data, and that's just the other data for that table. So the reason I've done that is to make sure that the data is displayed in the right manner. Otherwise, accountants will get very upset. So I've tried to make it a bit more crisp as well, simply by using the same font and the same colours to represent the font throughout. and that is really how I'd represent that data. One more thing is that this is based on the golden triangle. If you don't know what that is, you need to look at that. And what that means is the sizing of each of these components of the chart. So it's based on the Fibonacci sequence. So this is 1 in this in 1, and then it gets broken up into 3. So this one is basically the size of this and this. I've changed the size, so it's just very generally broken up. But what we try and do is we try and work on how we can size the dashboard to make sure that the eyes are drawn to the most important part. And in this chart, that would be the larger piece there. So if you've never looked at the golden triangle before, golden rectangle, sorry, it's a golden rectangle. Very hard to think when you have a dog as cute as this on your lap. But the golden rectangle is based on the Fibonacci sequence, and I recommend you look at that. I did write about that in my book about Tableau, and it's just as relevant for Power BI. So with that, let's get back into some of the slides. Now let's take a look at some of the interesting ways that we can measure financial performance. These are some just to get started, and then we'll look into others in more detail. So we have net profit and net profit margin. Now net profit margin is the ratio of net profits to revenues for a company. It's typically expressed as a percentage, and it identifies how much dollar in each revenue collected by a company actually translates into profit. We also have the net profit margin, which includes a company's total expenses, and it's a good way of defining profitability. You see here we've got the gross profit margin, and that's the percentage of revenue that exceeds the cost of goods sold. A high gross profit margin indicates the company is producing profit over and above its costs, which is a good thing. You'll also see here we have the operating profit margin, and it's a profitability or performance ratio that reflects the percentage of profit that a company produces or derives from its operations, prior to subtracting taxes and any interest charges. It's calculated by dividing the operating profit by the total revenue. And then we've got this weird one, EBITDA or EBITDA, depending on your accent. So we always called it EBIT or EBITDA in my classes at university, so I'm going to stick with that. The Scottish accent probably will not help, so bear with me. Now, what that actually means is essentially net income or earnings, with the interest, taxes, depreciation and amortisation added back in. So that's earnings before interest I, taxes, depreciation and amortisation. It can be used to analyse and compare profitability among companies, and also within industries as well sometimes. The reason we look at that one is it eliminates the effects of financing, legal and capital expenditures. So that's why it's more of an appropriate figure to understand the impact of decisions made in the organisation. So let's have a look at that one more closely. It can be used to analyse and compare profitability in companies and industries, and it focuses on the outcome of operating decisions while excluding the impacts of non-operating decisions. So these impacts can include items such as interest, tax or depreciation and amortisation. So basically it's trying to focus on the outcome of operating decisions and excluding things like financial, legal and accounting decisions. We've also got the enterprise value to earnings metric, and that's before interest, taxes, depreciation and amortisation ratio. And it compares the value of a company to the company's cash earnings less non-cash expenses. So in that example, we call that enterprise value to earnings. You sometimes see that abbreviated to EV. And that EV value divided by EBITDA, if you get the value below 10, then that's seen as healthy in an organisation. So what I'd like to do is I'll show you there are a number of different ratios here. This is from my blog, which I wrote some time ago, and you can follow up some of these. So the idea is you're trying to work out what is your main accounting objective, what is it you're trying to do. And here we are looking at things like profitability. So how well is the organisation doing? We've also got activity ratios. So that tells us about what the organisation is actually doing. So how much stock does it have sitting on its shelves, that kind of thing. We've also got liquidity. So that tells us how quickly could an organisation turn its revenues, how could it look at that in terms of cash. I talked about that recently in a blog post I did about PASS. SQL Server, the Professional Association of SQL Server, and I looked at that there. In a health organisation, we would be looking at good reserves of cash, but what we saw there is that there were issues potentially in how well they could cover their debts. So that was something that we were concerned about in that blog post. So you can go off and read that. It's interesting because when we start to look at accounting ratios and the numbers and we look at the balance sheet, what it starts to do is remove some of the value or some of the assumptions that people bring when they start to look at the data. Sometimes it can be really hard to read because the data can tell you something that you don't like to see, or sometimes it may not confirm a hypothesis or a steer that you would like to give to the data. It helps to remove any flavours that you're adding to the data in order to perhaps skew things a certain way. So that's quite an important visualisation, I think. I've tried to really break that down. So ratios in themselves obviously are not all the be-all and end-all, but they can give you some idea of the health of the organisation, and you're trying to look at a bigger picture and not just one thing and one thing only. So we've got a few other ones here. I'm going to explain what some of these are. So we've got Rona, which is obviously a lady's name, but that's not what it is here. So I've written a blog post about this as well. And RONA means return on capital employed. The way that's calculated is the net profit before long-term interest and tax divided by the total assets less creditors falling due within a year. So it's expressed as a percentage. So fundamentally it's calculated as profit over capital, but it's a very high level, that's what it's doing. So profits in that terminology can be a number of different metrics, so you have to be careful about which one you're using. It could be operating profit, it could be the net profit before interest and taxation, or it could be net profit after tax. So capital itself can be measured in different ways, and that's why we have to question the data and understand what's going on, and try and leave it as value-free as possible. We have to be as transparent as possible. Now, what's transparent to one person may not be transparent to someone else. So when I look at the PASS accounts, there's some argument amongst the database community that they're not transparent enough. But if you are looking at it from the accounting angle, they're actually incredibly transparent. So it depends on the lens, but to someone who doesn't have a financial background or never taken any sort of accounting or financial class, it may not be clear what's going on, but it's good to ask the right questions so you can get an understanding, particularly if you've got access to people in the community like me who can answer these questions. So capital itself can be measured in a number of ways. Total assets, for example, could be measured by shareholder funds and shareholder funds plus total liabilities. So you have to try and unpick and understand how that has been calculated and which combination of figures do you use. So unfortunately, the typical MVP answer holds, it depends. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that anymore because I'm no longer an MVP, having handed back the award. For a number of reasons you can read about in my blog. But the RONA definition can be accounted for in different ways, and there are other ways you can calculate that. We've got return on equity, return on shareholders' funds, so that's a very specific calculation, which is net profit before long-term interest and tax divided by share capital and reserves. And that's expressed as a percentage as well. So when we're visualising these, because we are visualising it as a percentage, there are different ways we can do that. Some people like using stacks bar charts, which are very easy to do in Power BI. You can also look at the gross profit margin. It's also a percentage, and you can measure that with gross profit divided by sales. So the ratios are made up of different things, depending on the angle people are, or the accounting decisions that are being used. So it's good to try and understand the different variations so you can ask really good questions, such as what does capital actually mean here? So how do we interpret all of these ratios? So with the RONA figure, we're looking at the effectiveness of assets that are financed by long-term creditors as well as shareholders, if there are any. And then we're looking at the profit generated as a result of these combined assets. So if you've got a higher RONA figure, that can mean the company has been very efficient about how it's using its assets. An increasing RONA may also show an emphasis on executing well, as that shows in improved profitability and overall performance. We've also got return on equity, and we see that here, also known as return on shareholders' funds. But that is looking at the same issue, but only specifically regarding shareholder funds, looking at it through that lens. So here we're taking the long-term creditors out of the picture and just looking at the shareholders. So understandably, shareholders want to see a high return on equity ratio. It means the money's working well for them in terms of their investment. And this would show the organisation was being effective in how it's investing or working with those investors' funds. Shareholders can also track progress by calculating the return on equity at the beginning of a period and then checking it at the end to see what the difference is. So we've also got net profit margin as well, and that shows the sales revenue after all the expenses have been removed. And it can, obviously, people want that to be quite large, but that may not be sustainable. So sometimes, especially in small to business, medium businesses, you can see this pattern of peaks and troughs, where they get a lot of money in, and then there's a period of attrition where that starts to disappear, and then we see another peak followed by another trough. So in small organisations, we tend to see these. So because we're looking at that, we have to understand what's going wrong there. Sometimes it can be a sales cycle. If you're a consultant, you may not get paid till the end of a project. So you have to start thinking about passive income in order to try and smooth out those peaks and troughs. So there are limitations in productivity financial ratios as well. So accounting ratios give us good insights into the management of a company, but it's not the whole story. You can go and ask them as well. So there's a business context surrounding decisions usually. Sometimes that can be hard to identify from the balance sheet, but you have to go and ask good questions and ask the right questions of the right people and not make assumptions before you start really. So for example, in this example, RONA itself doesn't calculate the company's future ability to create value. It's just at this point of time. Also, the values in the balance sheet might not represent the replacement cost if you were to replace everything in the company. So that may mask the reality of asset utilisation. In the time of the virus, we may find that organisations will start to have a fire sale, or they'll think about their equipment a bit differently because they are working from home more. So you may see changes in that. So what we can do is just have a think about how we can start to visualize some of these results. So we'll start to look at that soon. So we've gone through a lot of different ratios here. So that's just a quick summary of what we've just discussed. That ratios are not the be all and end all. We have to try and get the context as well. So let's have a quick look at the interpretation of the data. So I think it's good to look at the terminology as well. Understanding the terminology is important because sometimes terms can mean different terms are used to mean the same thing. That happens in many disciplines as well. So many sciences do that. So from the business person's perspective, this can sometimes be a bit confusing because people don't always know what they mean. So sometimes you do need to sit with an accounting book at hand, and I've got goodness knows how many accounting books when I'm trying to work through all this stuff. So just some terminology. I think sometimes people don't understand the difference between the balance sheet and a profit and loss. So I want to talk about that, and then we'll start to look at how we visualise some of this stuff in Power BI. So a balance sheet is basically a snapshot at a point in time of an entity's assets, what they own, versus their liabilities, what they actually owe. It shows how much capital has been invested by the owners, also known as equity, and other providers of finance, which is also known as debt. So assets and liabilities are ordered in a sequence depending on their maturity. And the balance sheet always balances. So if you're interested, go and pick an accounting book. I can give you references to many, I'm sure, if you want to get in touch and ask. And your balance sheet should always balance. It really records financial performance of an entity over a period of time. So it's just really a snapshot at that point. So a profit and loss actually records the financial performance of an organisation over a period, typically a year, when you look at most balance sheets. When you look at most profit and loss. The profit loss accounts explains how the profit or loss is generated through sales, the cost of sales and expenses. Income statement also explains in parts the growth or decline in equity, and that's the worth between the balance, and it tells you that between the balance sheet dates, the start and the end. The profit and loss itself is used by investors and analysts to understand and analyse the performance of the organisation, what the profit is, and the long-term survival of the organisation. So just to be clear on some other terms you might run into, an asset is broadly anything that makes the business money. A liability is broadly anything that costs the business money. Equity is shareholders' money in the business, and this can be viewed as the owner's claim against the business. You might see short and long term bandied around. Short term is up to a year, and long term is more than a year. So a current asset is quite specifically an asset for use in the short term, within a year, and a current liability is a liability due in the short term, such as a bank overdraft. So fixed assets can be held in the long term, such as property, and long-term liability is the liability payable in the long term. So this becomes quite interesting when we start to look at how people pay for the cloud, and this is something I've run into with Azure before. Organisations can use that as a type of expenditure where it could be a capital expenditure, which is what software licenses normally come under, or an operating expenditure, OPEX versus CAPEX. Now, some organisations do not like paying for cloud in that way, and there's a myriad of counting reasons why that might be. Sometimes if an organisation has a lot of operating debt, then it's easier to generate and get funds for capital expenditure than it is for operating expenses. Usually you're trying to get those operating expenses down. So when companies run into that, you can speak to Microsoft, and there are different ways that they can help with the accounting side of things, so that the cloud gets seen more as a software license, which can be included as capital. So that's just different ways that I've run into before. I'm not an accountant, I should say. I've just had to try and work my way around all of this when I'm trying to understand what the numbers mean when I'm doing business intelligence projects, and I thought it might be good to cover some of these here. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the limitations as well. So we've already been through this. I would say to be wary of any short-term attitude to profit. Sometimes you see that in the net profit margin. I think when I look at organisations, I'm trying to understand whether the owners themselves are serious about the business, or whether they are just changing their vision in a way that is just grabbing onto whatever seems to be handy at the time. We see those, I call them lifestyle businesses, and what that really means is, as long as the person is making enough to, I don't know, go and play golf in the golf course whenever they want to, and they're quite happy with that, then maybe they're not really looking at doing anything long term with the business, such as selling it. So they're just going to keep it ticking over. So I do see that from time to time. I used to do a lot of work with the small and medium businesses around where I live. So I joined various local business groups, and although it was fun, I did meet a lot of lifestyle businesses there, and I also found that people were more likely to barter than actually pay for your time. So I got offered a free massage if I would sort out someone's Excel spreadsheet. I'm not interested in doing that, but if you are, then go ahead and knock yourself out. For me, I run my own business. I enjoy it, enjoying the challenges, and I am very much looking towards what can I do to make my business sustainable. And that's what I look for when I look for business. Are they looking at the same markers that I am? So everyone has got different objectives. It's not that some are right and some are wrong, but that's where I'm coming from. Okay, so next steps. So let's have a look at how we can visualize some of these figures in Power BI. Before I do that, I want to show you some books for further reading. So you've got Valuation, McKinsey and Company. They actually used this as their own playbook when they were valuing companies. And apparently the authors took some convincing and arm twisting to get this published into a book. But they did, and I'm glad they did. It's now in its 7th edition, which was just very recently revised and updated. So I would recommend you have a look at that. And we've got Infonomics by Doug Laney. I'd recommend you go and read everything that he does, basically.